many worlds context. Now we're going to shift gears one more time. We're going to think about ideas that will also stretch our minds quite a bit, but are going to be much closer to our everyday human lived experience. What does the existence of countless other universes, much like our own, mean for how we live our lives, how we think about what our lives are? In the course of a long life, each of us will occasionally encounter a difficult decision that we're supposed to make. Stay single or get married, go for a run, have another donut, go to graduate school, or enter the real world. These are hard decisions. We can imagine very dramatic futures depending on how we decide. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to choose both sides rather than picking just one for every difficult decision that faced us? It might seem, at first glance, that many worlds makes this really possible. Imagine that we take a spin, as we've done many times before already in this course. We put it in an equal superposition of spin up and spin down with respect to some axis, and then we measure it. But the trick is that we decide ahead of time that if we see spin up, we're going to make one choice, and if we see spin down, we'll do the entirely different choice. According to many worlds, our measurement causes decoherence. It branches the wave function into two different worlds. And in each of those worlds, there's a version of you that makes two very different choices, as long as you actually keep your promise, as long as you do what you said you would do before you knew the measurement outcome. If you have an iPhone, in fact, there is an app that will let you do this called Universe Splitter. You can just plug in the two different choices you have. It will run a quantum random number generator. You can also find quantum random number generators on the internet. So you can implement this idea of two different copies of you doing two different things, making two different decisions. The problem, as you already know, is that these two versions of you have no way of communicating with each other to share notes afterward. So you can't say, this was the right decision to make. Even the most battle-hardened quantum physicist must admit that this whole business about different versions of you doing different things, making different decisions, it sounds a little crazy. But it is the most straightforward reading of our best understanding of quantum mechanics. So in this lecture and the next one, we'll be exploring the implications of this fact for our ordinary human lives. If I think that I will evolve into many future selves, rather than one unique future self, how does that change how I should think about myself and even how I should behave in such a branching universe? So far we've treated branching of the wave function as something that happens independently of ourselves, right? We simply go along for the ride. It's worth asking, just to be sure that we get it right, whether or not that's the proper perspective. One misapprehension that people have about many worlds is that different worlds are created when I make a decision. So let's ask the question, is that actually the right way or a right way to think about it? When I make a decision, are different worlds created in which I've chosen different things? Are there realities out there corresponding to every series of alternative choices that I could have made, universes that actualize all the possibilities of my life, universes in which I did ask someone out to the prom when I was in high school, and so forth? The short answer is no. We really shouldn't think about it that way. This is one of those situations where there are technicalities and footnotes, etc., but the short answer is no. The longer answer is the idea of making a decision, which is very central to our human lives, is not part of the fundamental laws of physics. Decisions are one of those useful, approximate, emergent notions that we find convenient to invoke when describing human-scale phenomena. What you and I label making a decision is a way of talking about a set of neurochemical processes happening in your brain. It's perfectly okay to talk about making decisions, just like it's okay to talk about tables and chairs. But none of that is anything over and above ordinary material stuff obeying the laws of physics. So one way of thinking about this question is, do the physical processes going on in your brain when you make a decision cause the wave function of the universe to branch with different decisions being made in each one of the different branches. If I'm playing poker, which I have been known to do sometimes, and I lose all my chips because I made an ill-timed bluff without a good hand, can I take solace in the idea that there is another branch of the wave function where I played that one more conservatively? No. You do not cause the wave function to branch by making a decision. You should know that by now. We've talked about how branches happen has nothing to do with human brains making decisions. In large part, that's really just due to what we mean, or ought to mean, by something causing something else. This is one of those philosophy questions, but it's a necessary one to confront here. Branching is the result of a microscopic process amplified to macroscopic scales. A system that is in a quantum superposition, typically a tiny little microscopic system, becomes entangled with a larger system, and that becomes entangled with its environment. That's what we call decoherence. That's what causes branching. But a decision, on the other hand, is a macroscopic phenomenon from the start. There are no decisions being made by the electrons and atoms in your brain. They're just obeying the laws of physics. What do we mean when we use words like decisions or choices? Decisions and choices and their consequences are useful concepts when we are talking about things at the macroscopic human-sized level. It's perfectly okay to think of choices as really existing and making a difference, as long as we confine such talk to the regime in which they apply. Choices in your life really exist, but they exist in the same way that tables and chairs really exist. They're not part of fundamental physics, but they're part of a vocabulary, a language we use for discussing the macroscopic world that we actually can wrap our brains around, right? The world where we don't have complete information about what every single atom is doing, but nevertheless we have coarse-grained information that is enough for us to get through the day, to make reasonable predictions about how things behave, what's going to happen next. That's the higher level, emergent level, at which we can talk about decisions and choices. So we can choose, in other words, to talk about a person as a bunch of particles obeying Schrödinger's equation. You could talk that way. Or we could equally well talk about them as an agent, a person who has volition, the ability to make decisions, and whose decisions can affect the world around them. The important point is that we can't use both descriptions at once. We can't start a sentence in the language of microscopic particles in the Schrödinger equation and end the sentence in the language of human beings making decisions. These vocabularies are applicable at different scales. So, in that understanding, your decisions don't cause the wave function to branch, because your decisions and the wave function branching exist as concepts at two very different levels of reality. The wave function branching is a relevant concept at the level of fundamental quantum physics. That's where we've been discussing it. That's where we know what the equations are doing. That's why we're able to make the predictions about all these different worlds. Your decisions is a relevant concept at the everyday macroscopic level of people, not at the fundamental physics level. There's no term in the standard model of particle physics that says, here's where people make decisions. What this means is, if someone asks, why were you late for work today? If your response is, well, because of the wave function of the universe and the Schrödinger equation, that does not count as a helpful answer. You will not get any points. No one's going to nod and go, okay, in that case, it's fine. You have to address the question being asked on the level at which it was being asked. In this case, people and decisions and traffic, not quantum mechanics and fundamental physics. They need to be compatible with each other. No one thinks that the traffic is going to somehow violate the Schrödinger equation, but they're two different ways of talking. So, there is no sense in which your decisions cause branching. What causes branching is a tiny quantum system in a superposition becoming entangled with the rest of the universe. But even if we think that way, which is the philosophically respectable way to think, we can still ask whether or not there exist other branches where you made different decisions. So we're saying that decisions don't cause branching, but now we're asking, are there nevertheless different branches where we made different decisions? And indeed there can be. The subtle point that reconciles all of this is how we should think about the notion of causality. Generally, it does make sense to imagine causal influences flowing from the fundamental microscopic level to the emergent macroscopic level. So it makes sense to say something like, the table is solid because of the structure of the molecules in the wood and the properties of electrons in the atoms, the Pauli exclusion principle, various microscopic ideas. That's okay as long as you keep your wits about you and know what you're doing. But the other way doesn't really work. You can't say the molecules in the wood have a certain structure because the table is solid. That's just not the way that it fits together to make those sort of causal explanatory claims. Therefore, it is better to say some microscopic process happened that caused branching, and it ended up the case that on different branches I made different decisions. That's very different from saying I made a decision and that caused the wave function of the universe to branch. Your decisions don't cause branching, but branching in the right circumstances can cause decisions. But for the most part, when you do make a decision, if we're being typical about it, not completely 100% accurate, but more often than not, even when you make a decision that seems to you like a close call at the time you make it, in fact, almost all of the weight, almost all the amplitude squared of the wave function, and therefore the probability, ends up being concentrated on a single branch, not spread equally over many alternatives. Why is that true? Well, just think about what physically happens in the neurons in our brains. They're cells. They consist of a central body and a number of appendages. We're getting a little technical about neuroscience here, but that's okay. No one stops us from appreciating other sciences as well. Most of the appendages on a neuron are called dendrites, and what they do is they take in signals from the surrounding neurons. But one of the appendages of our neurons is an axon, A-X-O-N. That's a longer fiber down which outgoing signals are sent. So we both get input and output from each neuron. The way that works is that charged molecules, ions, build up in the neuron until they reach a point where some kind of electrochemical pulse is triggered, which travels down the axon across synapses to the dendrites of other neurons. And all of this picture combines together. We have many such events going on, and we have the makings of a thought. That's what a thought is, just described at the microscopic level of cells and synapses and so forth. The secret is that for most part, not really a secret, the important fact is, for the most part, these processes can be thought of as being purely classical, or at least deterministic. A certain combination of neural firings is going to lead to a certain outcome. It's chemistry. Now, of course, quantum mechanics does play a role at some level whenever we have a chemical reaction, because after all, quantum mechanics sets the rules for how electrons want to jump from one atom to another, bind two atoms together, and so on. But when you get enough atoms together in one place, their overall net behavior can be described without any reference to quantum concepts like entanglement or the Born rule. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to take chemistry class in high school without first learning about the Schrödinger equation and worrying about the measurement problem. Most of chemistry is pretty classical just because there are a lot of atoms and molecules, and any little bits of quantum uncertainty will wash out. So decisions in our brains are best thought of as classical events, not quantum ones. While you personally might be a little bit unsure what decision you will eventually make, the outcome is already encoded in your brain, most likely. If you were Laplace's demon, if you knew the state of all the neurons and all the chemicals in your brain, you would know with very, very good probability what you were going to be doing next. To be completely fair, we're not absolutely sure about the quantitative extent to which this is true, simply because there's still a lot we don't know about the physical processes behind thinking. It is possible, it is conceivable, not likely, but it is conceivable that chemical reactions in your brain may play out differently depending on the entanglement between the different atoms involved. If that turns out to be true, certain people are thinking about it, but it's not a very popular scenario. It's an open question, though. Then there would be a sense in which your brain is a quantum computer. It would be a limited sense, but a very real one. When we think about decisions, though, as the inevitable outcome of microscopic processes, overall the picture tends to look classical and deterministic. At the same time, an honest Everettian, such as I hope we all are by now, admits that there will always be branches of the wave function on which quantum systems are appearing to do very unlikely things. If there's only a 0.001% chance of something happening, according to many worlds, it happens on some branch of the wave function. So even if the classical approximation to my brain implies that I'm going to bet all my chips at the poker table, one way or another, there is some tiny amplitude for a bunch of neurons to do unlikely things in the wave function of the universe and cause me to make a snug fold. But it's not my decision that is causing the branching, even then. It is the branching that I interpret as affecting my decision. In other words, by the time I make a choice, by the time I recognize that my cognition and my brain has come to a decision about what to do, the chemical reactions in my neurons have already branched the wave function. I just happen to have ended up on a branch in which the neurons have aligned in such a way so as to make a certain decision. So under the most straightforward understanding of the chemistry going on in our brains, most of our thinking has nothing to do with entanglement, branching of the wave function, other worlds, anything like that. We shouldn't imagine that making a difficult decision splits the world into multiple copies, each containing a version of you that chose differently. Unless, of course, you don't want to take responsibility for your decisions, then you are welcome to turn your decision making over to a quantum random number generator. But that's separate from ordinary thinking and decision making. Similarly, on a related vein, quantum mechanics has nothing to do with the question of free will as a human ability. It's very tempting to think that it might. You can see why people might draw the connection, because free will is often contrasted with determinism, right? Determinism is the idea that the future is completely determined by the present state of the universe. After all, we might find ourselves thinking, if the future is determined, what room is there for me to make choices? And in the textbook presentation of quantum mechanics, measurement outcomes are truly random. So, in that picture, we learned at the beginning of the 20th century that physics is not deterministic after all. Maybe that learning, maybe that new idea that we had in the beginning of quantum mechanics opens the door a crack for free will to sneak back in after it was banished by the Newtonian clockwork paradigm of classical mechanics. Now, when I'm saying all those words, it's hard for me to do because there's so much wrong with everything I just said. It's hard to know where to start. First, there's not a distinction between free will versus determinism. That's not the right contrast to look at. Determinism is contrasted with indeterminism. Free will should be opposed to no free will. And you can live in any one of the four possibilities: determinism and free will, indeterminism and free will, and so on. Determinism is very straightforward to define. Given the exact current state of a system, the laws of physics determine precisely what the state will be at later times. It is much trickier to define what we mean by free will. One usually hears free will defined as something like the ability to have chosen otherwise. That sounds like it's well-defined and compact, but there's an ambiguity there. The usual idea of free will imagines a comparison between what really happened in the actual world versus a different hypothetical scenario. And we know what really happened. We were in a situation, we made a decision, we acted accordingly. The question being asked is, hypothetically, if we wound the clock backward to that original situation, could we have decided differently? That's supposed to be the defining question of free will. The subtlety is that when we're playing this game of winding the clock backwards, it's crucial to specify exactly what is being kept fixed between the real and hypothetical situations. What remains the same? Is it supposed to be absolutely everything, down to the last microscopic detail, the position and velocity of every atom in our bodies? Or are we just imagining fixing the available macroscopic information, the overall thoughts in our brains, the overall positions of our bodies, but are we going to allow for variation within invisible microscopic details? Let's imagine that we're being hardcore about this question. That's okay for us to do. Let's compare what actually happened to a hypothetical rerunning of the universe. Our alternative universe will start from exactly the same starting condition, let's imagine, and then it remains exactly the same down to the precise state of every last elementary particle. In a classical deterministic universe, the outcome, which we will label our decision, would be precisely the same. The choice would have been determined from the start. So classically, it's a pretty simple dichotomy. There's no possibility that you could have made a different decision if you started from exactly the same initial state. And we have to admit, by contrast with this, according to textbook quantum mechanics, an element of true randomness is introduced. So we cannot confidently predict exactly the same future outcome from the same initial conditions. But whatever the underlying theory of quantum mechanics turns out to be, whether it's many worlds, objective collapse, hidden variables, or something else, as far as the experience of observers is concerned, quantum mechanics is not deterministic, okay? The underlying equations of something like many worlds or hidden variable theories are deterministic, but that doesn't matter for this kind of question because people don't experience those underlying equations. The best predictions they can make are truly not deterministic. But yet again, the fact that different outcomes are possible actually has nothing to do with what we usually mean by free will. Just because there can be a different outcome doesn't mean that it's because we manifested some kind of personal, supraphysical, volitional influence over the laws of nature. It just means that there is some unpredictable quantum random numbers and they came up differently. What really matters for the traditional strong notion of free will is not whether we are subject to deterministic laws of nature, but whether we're subject to laws of any sort, laws that are impersonal and that we cannot overrule. The fact that we can't predict the future isn't the same as the idea that we are free to bring it about. Even in textbook quantum mechanics, human beings are still collections of particles and fields obeying the laws of physics. There's no more free will there than there was in the classical deterministic clockwork universe. And of course, as we know, for that matter, deep down, quantum mechanics is not necessarily indeterministic, and this is where many worlds comes into the picture. Many worlds is a counterexample to the idea that the laws of nature truly are indeterministic. In many worlds, you evolve perfectly deterministically from a single person now into multiple persons at some future time. No choices come into the matter anywhere. And most hidden variable theories are also deterministic. Things just seem random because we don't know the values of the hidden variables. So the universe might very well be deterministic and yet appear indeterministic. Presumably, what matters to free will are the appearances of determinism, not the underlying reality. But the reason why this consideration of determinism versus indeterminism is not the final answer is that we also are free to contemplate weaker notions of free will. If you thought that free will meant the ability to override the laws of physics when we make decisions, it doesn't matter whether those laws are deterministic or not. But that's not the only thing it might mean. Let's dispense with the idea that we could have some kind of perfect microscopic knowledge of the world because we can't. That was never a realistic thought experiment. Instead, we'll refer to the macroscopic knowledge that is actually available to us. In that case, a different form of unpredictability arises. arises not from the fundamental laws of physics, from the lack of our perfect knowledge. Let's say I know something about my current mental state. At the microscopic level, there will typically be many different specific arrangements of atoms and molecules in my body and brain that are 100% compatible with that knowledge of what I'm calling my mental state. Some of those arrangements may lead to very different neural processes, sufficiently different that we would end up acting very differently if those arrangements had been true. So, how do we conceptualize this kind of uncertainty, this lack of perfect microscopic knowledge, when describing real human beings? The best we can realistically actually do to describe the way human beings or other conscious agents in the world act in reality is to attribute volition to them, the ability to choose differently. We attribute volition, we attribute choices to people when every one of us actually goes through the day. Attributing volition is what we do when we talk about ourselves and others in real life, because in the real world, it doesn't matter whether we could predict the future from perfect knowledge of the present, because we don't have such knowledge, nor will we ever. So we come to the conclusion that whatever the fundamental laws of physics are, the right way of talking about people is as agents making choices. And this has led philosophers going back as far as Thomas Hobbes to propose what is called compatibilism between underlying deterministic laws and the reality of human choice making. Most modern philosophers are actually compatibilists about free will. That doesn't mean that it's right, but the point I'm trying to emphasize is there's no necessary conflict between impersonal underlying laws of physics and talking about human beings as if they have free will. In this picture, free will is real just like tables and temperature and branches of the wave function. It is a higher level emergent phenomenon. The microscopic laws of physics have nothing to do with it. As far as quantum mechanics is concerned, it doesn't matter whether you are a compatibilist or an incompatibilist concerning free will. In neither case should quantum uncertainty affect your stance one way or the other. Even if you can't predict the outcome of a quantum measurement, that outcome stems from the laws of physics, not any personal choices made by you. We don't create the world by our actions. Our actions are part of our world. Whether you are an advocate or a skeptic of many worlds, you should admit that the theory suggests a truly radical revision in our best view of reality as a whole. In addition to the world that any one of us experiences, this scenario suggests that there are going to be countless other worlds with very similar, or maybe not so similar, configurations of matter and energy. Most amazingly, including people who share our personal memories and pasts. Ordinary language doesn't have a readily available word for people like this. They're not siblings or cousins, but also they're not ourselves. They are separate, different people. Maybe the closest concept is something like twins, since they do share a common past with us. But unlike usual twins, these people share much more than a brief existence as a single-celled zygote. And of course, they can never interact once we split the universe and the world branches. Now, it would be perfectly natural to think that if we change our fundamental view of reality in this dramatic way, that should imply correspondingly significant changes in how we should live our lives. If we care about the well-being of future people in the universe, now we have to care about a whole multiverse of them. It seems a little bit weird to say that we're dramatically changing how many people they are, who they are, how they came to be, and yet, what I want to suggest is more or less exactly that. I think that despite the fact that many worlds is a very different view of the universe as a whole, the implications for our lives and how we should live them turn out to be relatively minimal, at least in the most straightforward way of asking these questions. To each individual on some branch of the wave function, life goes on, just as if they had lived in a single world with truly stochastic quantum events. But the implications, the stakes are very high, right? So these issues are worth exploring very carefully. Think about the notorious quantum suicide experiment, as we mentioned in Lecture 12. It's a pretty dramatic story set up purely for thought experiment purposes. We imagine a deadly device that is triggered by a quantum measurement, where the quantum measurement is supposed to have a 50% chance of triggering a gun that shoots a bullet into my head at close range, and a 50% chance of doing nothing. According to many worlds, that implies the existence of two branches of the wave function, one of which is going to contain a living version of me, the other which contains a dead version. From my perspective, the branch on which the gun fired isn't one that any version of me ever gets to experience. My descendant, or who would be my descendant on that world, is dead. But my descendant does live on the branch where the gun didn't fire. So the question arises, is there a sense in which I live forever? And in fact, some people have claimed I shouldn't be reluctant to do this experiment because there's a version of me who is still alive in the multiverse. As we argued back in Lecture 12, I don't think that's the right way to think about it, and here's basically why. Even in a single universe theory, we don't want to be suddenly killed, even if we wouldn't be around afterward to be upset. The point is that we are upset now by the prospect that we could be killed at some future time. Just saying that once you're dead you don't have any regrets afterward doesn't mean that I don't mind being dead. This goes back to something we discussed in earlier lectures. It's important to treat individuals on different branches of the wave function as distinct persons, even if they descended from the same individual in the past. This is a fundamentally new concept that we have to learn to deal with if you accept many worlds. There is an important asymmetry between how we think about our future versus our past in the many worlds scenario. Ultimately, that's because of special conditions when our universe started at or near what we call the Big Bang. Back then, there was not that much entanglement and correspondingly just one branch of the wave function, or a relatively small number of branches at any rate. Ever since, the number of branches has been growing as the universe evolves. We don't know why the universe had this special initial condition. I talk about this in my other course called Mysteries of Modern Physics Time, speculating on some of the possible scenarios. But for whatever reason, the quantum past and future are very different in our real universe. So as a result, any one individual can trace their lives backward in a unique line of continuity through a single person, a single set of lives. But if we go forward in time, we're going to branch into multiple people, according to the many worlds view. There is not one future self that is picked out as really you. Asking a question that seems very natural, that you can easily construct using words in the English language like, who am I going to end up being? That's not a sensible question. All of these future people are legitimately future versions of you in some sense. Again, the language fails us, but you know the physics picture here. But it's equally true that there is no one person constituted by all of these future individuals. They're not one person living on different branches. They are separate. They're as much separate as identical twins are distinct people despite descending from that single cell. Now, these people on separate branches cannot influence each other, they cannot even talk to each other in any way, and they can't know what happens to each other. They happen to share a common past, but completely distinct futures. So as a result, we might care about what happens to the other versions of ourselves that live on other branches, but that doesn't mean we should think of them as us. They're different people. So let's illustrate why this is a sensible attitude, using a favorite kind of philosophical thought experiment, handing out money. Philosophers like to imagine that they can operate operationalize what you care about by asking how you would respond to different offers of being given money or having money taken away. So imagine the following. You're just about to perform a measurement of the vertical spin on an electron that you've prepared in an equal superposition of spin up and spin down. So as we know, you predict a 50-50 chance of seeing either spin up or spin down. In many worlds, there'll be a world where it's spin up and one on which it's spin down. But before you do the experiment, before you press the button, a random philanthropist enters your lab, and they offer you the following bargain. If you measure the spin up, they will give you $1 million. But if you measure the spin down, you will give them $1. And you're not destitutely poor, so you have $1 to spare. Under ordinary ways of thinking about rational decision making, you would be wise to take the deal. For all intents and purposes, for your life, it's just as if you're being offered a bet with equal chances of winning $1 million or losing just $1. Even if you know, in many worlds, that there will absolutely certainly be some future selves that will be out $1. The expected reward to such a bet is quite large if you think about it as a probability, so you're going to take that offer. But now imagine that you were a little quicker in your experimental setup. So you pushed the button before the philanthropist came in. And what you observed is spin down, okay? The result that would have lost you $1 in the previous scenario. So the philanthropist comes in, sees that you've already done the experiment, and turns out that they're a little bit pushy. They want to make the deal. And so the philanthropist gives you the following sales pitch. There is a version of you on another branch of the wave function that is right now being given $1 million. But since you were unlucky enough to measure spin down, it's only fair, they say, that you should give them $1 in this branch. Think about that one. What I would suggest is there's no reason for you to be happy about this just because a different branch has a version of you getting rich. You do not benefit. You, the person who is on the spin down branch, doesn't have any material consequence from knowing or thinking that there's a different version of you that is $1 million richer. Nor is there any reason to feel any moral compulsion to give up your $1. You are not the person on the other branch, and they are not you. They're not part of you. You do share a past. You used to be the same person in a very real sense, and that's, once again, hard to wrap our brains around a little bit. But now, you are separate. Once you've measured the spin, once the branching has occurred, we have two different people. Neither your experiences nor your rewards should be thought of as being shared by various copies of you on different branches. The philanthropist missed a chance to make that bet. And even if you refuse to hand over the $1, the folks on the other branch have no way of knowing that. It can't have any direct effect on whether or not the version of you on the other branch gets paid the $1 million or not. Now, that may seem reasonable, right? That may seem like a reasonable policy to have when it comes to your own personal well-being. But what about that of others? How does knowing about the existence of other worlds affect our notions of moral or ethical behavior? How we should behave in the world to try to be a good person, is that affected by the fact that there could be different worlds in which different people feel different consequences? So to be clear about just what the question is that we're asking, let's imagine we're contrasting two different scenarios. So we'll be very specific. There's many different scenarios you can imagine. We're just going to think about two and imagine what the consequences are and how we should behave differently. One of the scenarios is many worlds. It's the usual story of decoherence and branching and so forth, and we're going to ask how you should behave in that universe. The other scenario is some version of single world quantum mechanics. Okay, so there's still quantum mechanics. What happens in a quantum event is supposed to be, in this scenario, truly random, stochastic, unpredictable. It's going to follow the frequencies, the statistics given to us by the Born rule. But there's only one stochastic world. And let's imagine that we accept the arguments that derive the Born rule in many worlds. If you don't accept the arguments for the Born rule in many worlds, you don't need to go this far in your arguments. You don't need to worry about morality or anything like that if you don't think that many worlds covers the Bourne rule, many worlds would just be non-viable from the start. You don't need to worry about more complicated philosophical questions. So what we're really comparing is a single world with random happenings along the way to a set of many worlds where everything allowed happens in some world, but crucially to which we attach different weights to different happenings, always in accordance with the Bourne rule. The question in front of us is, does the actual existence of these other worlds, does taking them seriously as real things that are out there in Hilbert space, with people on them feeling and loving and so forth, have any effect on our moral decisions, even if we think about probability in the same way? Now, there's a difficulty right away, which is that people don't agree on how to think about morality. The right way to define morality and to be a moral person is itself a controversial subject, even if we all agree that there's only one single world, even if we were to agree. But it's instructive to consider two broad categories of moral theory, what are called deontology and consequentialism. For deontologists, moral behavior is a matter of obeying the right rules. So the idea is that an action is inherently right or wrong. It's not a matter of what the consequences of that action might turn out to be. Whereas consequentialists, as you might expect, unsurprisingly, have the alternative view. A consequentialist would say that we should work to maximize the beneficial consequences of our actions. Utilitarians, who advocate maximizing some measure of overall well-being, are paradigmatic consequentialists. And there are other options, but these two options for moral reasoning illustrate the basic points that we want to make. So how would these different schools of moral thought be affected by agreeing that there are multiple worlds out there with slightly different conditions? At first glance, deontology would seem to be unaffected by the possible presence of other worlds, at least in the straightforward cases, right? If the whole point of your theory is that actions are intrinsically right or wrong, regardless of what outcomes they lead to, the existence of more worlds in which those outcomes can occur doesn't seem like it should really matter. A typical deontological rule would be Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. The categorical imperative says, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. It's a little bit hard to parse Kant's phrasing sometimes. What he's trying to say is, you should choose actions that you think other people in the same circumstances should also choose. If this is your preferred moral approach, it would seem like it would be safe here to replace a universal law by a multiversal law. In other words, any law worth having should be a law that should hold in all branches of the wave function, right? That shouldn't alter any substantive judgment about what kind of actions might qualify. We're not saying what is a moral action or an immoral action. We're just saying that if that's the way you reason about morality, actions are intrinsically good or bad, the fact that you live in one universe versus many probably doesn't change many things. So I think that it's fair to say that in the most straightforward, you're not trying too hard to be weird versions of deontology, the fact that there might be a multiverse out there, the fact that many worlds might be the right version of quantum mechanics, doesn't change a lot about how you should act. But in philosophy, much as in physics, it's very difficult to make a claim that something is truly impossible. It is impossible to come up with a rule that satisfies the following conditions. And indeed, it's very possible to come up with a version of deontology, a deontological moral system, that would lead us to behave differently in a single stochastic world versus many worlds. Let's say that among our moral rules was one that said, never act in such a way that a person will certainly be harmed by your action. Okay? The idea there, the important part of that rule is the word certainly. That's going to be a crucial word. If we thought that the world was quantum mechanical but just a single world with random unpredictable events, there might be conceivable consequences of our actions that are possible but very, very unlikely, so unlikely that we would typically just discount them. But if we really had a rule, once and for all, against having anyone experience those bad effects, into many worlds, somebody certainly is going to.